Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're going to focus on the role of monetary policy and how monetary policy will influence a lot of the decisions that are made in our economy. Now, I used to work for the Federal Reserve Bank, so I can add a little bit of value to this in terms of how the Fed is going to look at the money supply and change the level of interest rates to impact economic growth. But before they do that, they have some key economic goals they have to focus on. So when we look at the Fed, they're focused on price stability. Now, when I was at the Fed, price stability was very important. They wanted to make sure that prices were stable to ensure that consumers feel confident in terms of spending. We wanted high employment. So you wanted to have people have jobs, have the ability to actually work. When the Fed can influence the amount that people are hiring, that's a good thing. That's a positive thing for the economy. Another one we want to look at is economic growth. Economic growth is a very important part of the Fed policies because economic growth is something that we want to continue on growing for an economy. The last one is stability of financial markets and institutions. When markets are stable and financial markets are stable, people feel comfortable and they're more willing to spend money. So stability is very important. Now think to yourself, I'd like to ask you this question. Which one of those four do you think are the most important for our economy right now that the Fed should focus on? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about that. Now, you could argue any of the four, but the key to this is, and this is what the people on the Fed board did when I was there, they would argue, all of them would be arguing a different point of one of those. And they would use a specific data indicator to do that as well. So we're going to look at some of the targets that they looked at. The Fed tries to keep the unemployment and inflation rate low. So that's a very big challenge because if the unemployment rate's low, that means people are working, and if people are working, they're probably going to be getting income in their pockets. And when they get income in their pockets, they're probably going to be spending money. So that could create inflation in our economy. So we want to set some type of targets that were closely related to Fed policies, such as GDP, employment, and the price level. Now, here is a graph of the money market right now. You notice the money supply graph is depicted by MS1, and the money demand is depicted by MD. Money demand will only move if consumers demand more or less money. Now, money supply is only dictated by looking at changes in the Fed buying or selling of government securities. And when they do that, that's going to have an impact on the money supply and the impact on the interest rate. So let's say the Fed wants to increase the money supply, and they use this by buying or selling in terms of the New York Fed. So when they start to put this allotment in, and they want to see an increase in the money supply, the Fed will probably buy Treasury securities. They'll go to New York and say, we need to buy X amount to buy Treasury securities. And in turn, what's going to happen, you're going to notice that the interest rate falls. So let's think about this. Interest rate falls, think of your daily life. Consumers, businesses, government, they can all borrow at lower rates. And that's a very effective thing in our economy. When you can borrow at lower rates, that's going to stimulate spending. And that's going to create people wanting to borrow and to actually create some momentum for our economy. And we look at this, the Fed has changed rates a lot. And you notice in our economy right here, interest rates used to be, the federal funds rate used to be in the 6 to 4 range for quite a long period of time. But then you notice the interest rates started to fall dramatically, indicating probably the economy needs some type of stimulus. And then interest rates started to increase. And when they increased, probably the economy might have been growing a little bit too fast because they're looking at one of those indicators and they're trying to make decisions on what's occurring in our economy. And that's important to evaluate. So when the Fed increases the supply of reserves, they got to buy something. And what happens? Interest rates increase. Interest rates decrease. So let's put this into effect. And we look at monetary policy. they can influence a couple things. And we have two different types of monetary policy that they can impact. Expansionary monetary policy, which is looking at lower interest rates, which will help stimulate the economy, or contractionary monetary policy, which is going to be looking at higher interest rates, which will probably slow down spending a little bit, which will also impact inflation. But we have these key things. And if we put these things in motion, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the economy. So I'd like to give you a recent decision by the Fed that just happened and how the Fed decided to cut interest rates by their impact. And look at this live news.
To a new range of 1.5 to 1.75%. Removing the phrase that will act as appropriate. Instead, the committee snouts out, assess the appropriate path of the Fed funds. Two dissents. One, Rosenberg and George wanted to.
So look at, in that video, you notice that the Fed decided to cut rates. And given that the Fed decided to cut rates, that created a little bit of differences in terms of expectations. So when the Fed decides to do something, markets react immediately to that decision. Markets are based off of expectations. And I thought that video would be interesting to show you how this class or this concept right here that we're looking at applies right directly to how the Fed will respond in terms of those markets. Now, let's make the connection from this interest rate changes. If we look at these new home sales spiked dramatically from 2000 to 2005. One of the indicators for why that could happen is very low interest rates. And the low interest rate that we just saw by the Fed doing something to the money supply and lowering interest rates causes people to race to go out and buy houses. And then when interest rates start to change a little bit, you notice differences. So I think this was a good concept that we focus on this week, that we looked at changes in money supply, changes that cause changes in the interest rate, that cause changes in how expectations will develop in our economy. I appreciate for your time, and if you have any additional questions, please let me know.